Good morning. I'm Lisa Elser. I'm one of the patient partners on the Clinical Trials BC Advisory Board, and I'm absolutely honored to be moderating this panel. Increasingly, research is care. Populations that are unable to access the trials they need are simply not getting the best care we can offer. Our speakers on this panel will address the trials and trial access for geriatric and pediatric patients, pregnant and lactating people, and newcomers to Canada. There'll be time at the end for questions, so please keep a note if you have questions you'd like to ask. I'll bring up our first panelist. Dr. Darby Thompson is a statistician and leads Canadian operations for Emmes, which provides full-service clinical research services, supporting the pharma and biotech industry, government, not-for-profit clients who are undertaking research in life science. He holds a PhD in statistics and is an adjunct professor at SFU. He'll be speaking on the inclusion of older adults in clinical trials.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. As you've heard, I'm a statistician. I'll try to keep the formulas to a minimum. So my background is going to be mostly related to study design and the operations perspective of how we can create trials that are accessible. And I'll give you a little bit of background on the population that we really want to focus on in today's discussion. So are we talking? I'm focusing on older adults in clinical trials. And do I have an advancing or? It's where? Oh, it's right here. There we go. Okay, thank you. So we'll focus first on what is the special population here in older adults. Well, greater than 65 is what everybody thinks of. We've even heard of an upper age limit category and eligibility criteria that often occurs in protocols. And I've been on dozens of protocols where investigators or sponsors automatically put, we need under 65. There's been a tremendous amount of attention paid to this population of people that are over 65 for decades. There are statutes, there are guidances, there are toolkits, there are working groups. All of the structure is in place to try and increase the number of people over 65 who are enrolling in clinical trials. There are, of course, ethical, sensible, and business cases for this, for inclusion of this population. So what exactly is the problem? Well, in fact, is it industry automatically excluding people who are potentially at higher risk and potentially more likely to fail their primary endpoint for a variety of reasons? Well, it's not. And perhaps it's not even the trials anymore. I just took a quick look on clinicaltrials.gov, and of the open, contemporary trials that are currently recruiting or in follow-up, 80% of them include people over 65. Among industry trials, it's 86%. Among late phase industry trials, it's even higher. The guidances, the statutes, the regulations have had the desired effect. The trials are open to people in this population, but are they really enrolling? Let's take a look. So there's actually a very nice paper came out last year that actually looked at the data over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2019. And they looked at every new drug application and every new biologic application that came through the FDA and actually looked at the people who enrolled in those studies. The finding is actually that it's only adults in the oldest age groups, the older elderly, if you will, those over 75 or 80 who are not represented. In fact, I probably don't have time to go through this in detail, but in fact, people who are below 75 in their 60s, 60 is the new 50, probably 70 is the new 50, really. People in their 60s and early 70s have the time, have the mobility, have the interest to give back and participate, and they're overrepresented in each of these indications, in heart failure, in stroke, in non-small cell lung cancer, and insomnia. The blue bar represents prevalence in trials. The light blue bar represents prevalence in the population. If we're able to share this later, you'll see the later ages are underrepresented, but everything below 75, between basically 50 and 75, is overrepresented. People over 65 are enrolling in the trials. It's really the older elderly that are the special population who are really not participating or not able to participate in clinical research. And what is the problem? Well, it's, of course, the trials. It's the classical equity versus equality challenge. Trials are not built for older elderly people. Endpoints don't necessarily apply. The modeling preceding clinical exposure usually doesn't include older elderly people. And there's a possibility of significant over or underdosing that's going to wildly affect the risk-benefit ratio for older elderly people. And as we've seen, clinical trials include people over 65. We've done away in large part with an older age limit. But there's lots of eligibility criteria, as you all know, that are exclude complex older elderly people based on polypharmacy, multimorbidity, or simply the complex requirements that they might have to undergo in a clinical trial. And of course, the additional physical, mental, and emotional burden of participation. But in addition, and I've just included, if you know this, you know this. If you don't, you should know it. Because this is one of my favorite internet videos where the dogs are really trying to kill each other because there's a fence. Purely because there's a fence. And I use this analogy a lot for a different perceptual standard. There's how are trials perceived? And in particular, in older elderly people, we have a perception gap. There's a lot of doubts about why clinical research is being done. What are the intents of this? Are they exploiting people? This seems complicated, because it usually is. And do they have somebody they know that's participating? Is this a new set of investigators' touch points that they've not interacted with before in their healthcare journey? So what are the solutions to this? Well, I, being a statistician for a long time early in my career, quality by design was a mantra that we espoused to our clients and to ourselves. And I think diversity by design is the new paradigm. And much of our challenge can be addressed in the design stage. I think even before the topics on here, the first element is let's make trials as small and fast as possible to expose as few people as possible to risk and to lower the threshold for the number of people we need to participate, number one. Number 2 and 3 are simplify, simplify, simplify. The eligibility criteria has to be as simple as possible so I, as a statistician, feel comfortable generalizing back to the people who might be using this product. Simplify data collection, simplify study procedures. It is not I who complicates trials. I've rarely worked with a sponsor or an investigator who wants to run a more simple trial than I do, and please, I hope I get to work with one of those people soon. We need to engage patient advocates to understand benefit and harm for meaningful endpoints. Older elderly people, their perception, their belief, their reality of benefit or risk is very different from a 45-year-old. What are the endpoints that matter to those people? How can we design trials that are going to be appealing to them and not have them feel like they're being exposed to undue risk through the process? And of course, plan for inclusion within the study or portfolio. And I say that because you can easily exclude extremely complex people from enrolling in a trial, but still plan to include collection of data from all elements of the population in other ways by doing follow-on studies that are including a large PK/PD component in order to extend your endpoints beyond the trial that you've run. There are many different technical approaches, and that whole first bullet is all just, let's sit down and think about this for a while. And those are all very doable. The lower portion is implementation sort of solutions. And these are things that are going to be familiar to everybody, but the mantra is that we have to accept different approaches for different segments of the population. And in fact, there's a very nice paper, Forsat et al. I don't know, I have to turn around. Forsat et al. 2020. And honestly, if you didn't know I was talking about an older elderly population, you'd probably look at this and think these are meaningful impediments or improvements to retention for any population. But specifically for older elderly, you'll see that the things that really increase retention are continual updates on study progress. These are communication, relationship building elements. These are, can we communicate in a meaningful way? Can we create a positive relationship with people? Can we respect their time by payment? Can we have flexibility and frequent and early expectations and explanations about what's going on? And finally, I say these sorts of things in any opportunity I get to talk about clinical trials to a group of people executing them. We want to continue moving research closer to care. Older elderly people are continually engaging with the healthcare system. there is no reason we need a parallel group of investigators to engage with these people and make their lives more complicated. If research was more integrated with care, it would be a more seamless transition to actually use the data that these people are contributing to our system for the benefit of both themselves and the people that will come after. So that's the mindset of research in our care paradigm. Of course, technology, the CEO of our company said something just the other day, and he says he's very right. Technology has impacted virtually every part of our lives and every industry we work in. And frankly, it's impacted clinical trials among the least of all, since we've converted to web-based data collection and some electronic data capture systems. But fundamentally, the way trials are run is the same way they were run 20 years ago. And this has to change. But of course, that has to come along with the research infrastructure. We can't just do this with software. We need the people, the training, the expertise to protect human subjects, to maintain confidentiality, to maintain respect for people, and quality of data. And the last point I wanted to make is another critical one that I, as a statistician who focuses really on the outputs of the clinical trial as well as the design, is we've heard Reach BC once already. We're going to hear more of them. I think it's a fantastic organization that does a lot to bring clinical trials to the public. But that's at the exciting recruitment stage. I think we need more communication about why we're doing research, about how it's going, and about what we learned. This is science. We never finish a trial and throw it away and pretend it never happened. We learn something new on every single clinical trial, and there's no reason we can't turn that process into a continuum of information for people to help change perspectives on what clinical research is and why participation is valuable. So that's it. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Darby. Our next speaker is Dr. Jacqui Whiteway, who is Senior Director and Head Pediatric Strategy Liaison in the Center for Pediatric Clinical Development at ICON, a leading global contract research organization. She holds a PhD in molecular biology, and her research experience gained at BC Cancer Research Center and in startup biotech company inspired her to pursue the unique challenges of clinical trials. Jacqui has contributed to over 500 clinical studies for over 250 sponsors across all therapeutic areas, with a growing focus on those impacting children. She'll be speaking on clinical trials in pediatrics, particularly on why we need them.
Okay, and now for something completely different, following on that. I'd just like to first thank you all for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about that special population that is pediatrics. And in trying to think of the best way to address this audience and pediatrics, what to talk about, unlike the statistician, actually, I thought I'd talk about numbers. I figured everybody likes numbers, so I know one who will, and hopefully I'm right. And let me see if I can figure this thing out. Okay. So numbers, starting with 70%. So 70% of drugs that are used in kids right now haven't been tested in kids. That's on average globally developed nations. In Canada, it's between 50 and 80%, depending on the setting. And we are lagging Europe and the US. As an example, between 2007 and 2015, they approved twice the number of drugs in kids than we did. 9 years. That's on average how long it takes from when there's an approved drug for adults that it becomes available to kids. So 9 years. If you think about that, that's a childhood. That's even a lifetime. In oncology, and my background is a little bit in oncology, you're going to hear it a couple times here, from a first-in-human trial to a first-in-child trial, there's a median of 6.5 year lag. That's a median. It ranges over 25 years. And that's really important because cancer is the #1 cause of death by disease for kids, developed nations globally, including, of course, Canada. And over the past half decade, there has been significant progress. On average in Canada, there's an 83% survival rate for kids with cancer. It's really important to understand that that represents The range of cancers, there's some where there can be an over 95% cure rate or survival rate. There's some that are extremely dire, less than 10%, less than 5%. And it's really important to understand that surviving is not thriving. So over 90% of survivors, childhood survivors of cancer, will have a late effect by the age of 45. So a late effect meaning a chronic condition. A third of those can be serious and life-threatening by the age of 45. This isn't hugely surprising when you consider that about half of the drugs used for kids today with cancer were approved before the 1980s. That is, a lot of kids today are being treated with cancer therapeutics that were being used during the Vietnam War. And when you think of cancer development, I'm sure everybody here is aware of the boom in precision therapeutics, targeted cancer therapeutics in the past 20, 30 years. That's after the 80s. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Okay, so you may have some questions now, you may not. One question might be, why does this matter? Don't we want to protect children from research? They're vulnerable, susceptible. Shouldn't we be treating them really robustly in adults, or testing them robustly in adults, and then treating the kids? And the answer to that, Alison already mentioned in her address, and I'm sure you've all heard this before. In fact, it goes back to the late 1800s, is children are not small adults. But have you really thought about what that means? Like, what does that mean to you that a child is not a small adult? I'm going to help you out here. This could be a talk on itself, so I'm going to keep it hopefully pretty simple. I'm going to make a couple points, maybe 3. And the first way that they're not just small adults is they're not just one population. Children represent multiple populations, and they can be divided in a number of ways: age, development. What's represented here is the ICH definitions. So, and that's by age, and it's going from the preterm newborn up through to adolescence, and that somewhat arbitrary number when they become adults, depending on where they live, and that's a whole nother talk that I won't get into. So that's the first point. The second point is that this isn't really a linear progression from when you're a newborn and you're more vulnerable and more susceptible to a drug to becoming less vulnerable and less susceptible. They truly are different populations, and there's a lot of changes happening during that development. When we're newborns, you know, we start out mostly water, our body composition with less fat. We've got less serum proteins. You've got a higher gastric pH, so it becomes more basic. There's a lot of changes happening. Your liver enzymes fluctuate, and think about drug metabolism. In fact, preschoolers, like around 3 years old, their liver and kidneys are proportionally much larger than adults. Their skin is twice the size proportionally than adults. And so that means that sometimes they might need more drug proportionally than adults. There's a lot of complicating factors. Sometimes there's no safe dose. Sometimes they need more. Sometimes they respond differently. So, you know, there's so many aspects there. It's complicated. But weight-based dosing doesn't always work. So we can't just test in adults and then go to kids. There's another change I'd like to bring, or difference I'd like to bring to your attention that you may or may not be aware of. And again, that's oncology. I said I was going to come back to this. And what's really important to understand here is that cancer is a molecular disease. Adult cancers and pediatric cancers can look quite different. There's cancers that adults have, that kids don't have, and vice versa. I mean, what do you think of when you think of the most common cancers that are out there and where a lot of the research is? Lung, prostate, breast, colorectal. Those really aren't seen in kids. But the molecular underpinning of those is similar. And so drugs, again, the last 20 to 30 years, big boom in drugs that are precision-targeted molecular therapeutics in the oncology world are targeting those changes. So those drugs that have been developed for adults for those molecular targets can work for the child cancers that look quite different. The example I've put here is a common adult lung cancer. And the underlying molecular change is an ALK rearrangement. And that also is the molecular basis for a number of pediatric cancers, including ALCL, neuroblastoma. The drug that was approved for the lung cancer in adults was approved in 2011, and it wasn't approved until 10 years later, 2021, for kids. So I hope, again, big picture, I hope I didn't scare you with too many numbers. I have a lot more where that came from, so just so you know. But I hope you do understand from these that I have shared that we do need to protect children through research, not from it. And I wanted to share one last number with you, and it's a number that was shared with me by a friend and colleague, a pediatric oncologist, who said, you know, Jacqui, we talk in numbers all the time. Clinical trials, no offense to statisticians, and survival rates in patient care. She said, you know, when patients come to me, how long does my child have? What is the survival rate for this drug, for this cancer? And she said, there's some great news. You know, there are some cancers with a drug that has an over 95% survival rate. But if your child is that 5%, then that number means nothing. And so the most important number that we all have to remember is that every individual, every clinical trial participant is an N of 1. It's a sample of 1. And that I'm going to leave you with, and the picture, I'm going to let you figure out why I've put that there. So thank you. And I'll hand you back to Lisa.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jacqui. Dr. Elisabeth McClymont is a postdoctoral fellow from the UBC Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. She completed her PhD under the supervision of Dr. Money. Her current work focuses on reproductive infectious diseases in women, including HPV, HIV, and CMV. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Elisabeth was part of 3 national studies addressing COVID-19 in pregnancy, including disease surveillance and post-licensure vaccine evaluation. She'll be speaking on clinical trials with pregnant and lactating people.
I think when the organizers invited me to come speak today, they didn't know that I'd also be 8 months pregnant at the time. So I fit the bill in a couple different ways. In terms of disclosures, I just wanted to let folks know that I've received salary support in the form of postdoctoral funding from the CTN and also Michael Smith Health Research BC in conjunction with CanFAR. And we currently have a clinical trial going on, not related to pregnancy, but with in-kind support from Merck. So unlike my co-panelists, I decided I would not go with numbers, and I would instead go with a bit of the emotional side. And so starting with an anecdote to get you thinking about this population. So just imagine for a moment that the year is 2021. It's not so long ago. I know we can all remember what it was like to be at that stage in the midst of a global COVID-19 pandemic. And at this point, vaccines had now become available to the general population in BC. And so first, thinking about if you're a prenatal care provider, the risk of severe outcomes, is worse for moms and babies if the pregnant woman is infected with COVID-19. So her chances of going to hospital and being admitted to ICU are elevated if she's infected with COVID-19, and her baby's at higher risk for preterm delivery. But there are no clinical trial data for COVID-19 vaccines in pregnancy. You do have a little bit of minimal self-report data on safety that's come out of the US, who was a little bit ahead of us. And so the guidelines so far have been made based on what we call expert opinion. And expert opinion is a couple experts getting together and putting forth what their best recommendation is based on what they know, but no hard data. So what do you recommend for your pregnant patient in this case? Then shifting and thinking as the pregnant person, your provider has explained all of this to you, this elevated risk, but the fact that there's no data from the clinical trials on the vaccine. And so you then have to decide, do you get vaccinated? So when we think about pregnant and lactating populations, historically, they've been often excluded from clinical trials due to safety concerns. And this is despite the fact that there's a wide array of different medications that are frequently taken during pregnancy. These include vaccines, antimicrobials, antihypertensives, antidepressants, et cetera. And so there's clearly a need for not only preventative interventions, but also management of acute and chronic illness within pregnancy as well. And as you might have started to think about when we were going through that anecdote, there are unique considerations for this population. So firstly, related to the physiological changes of pregnancy and postpartum, this can have dosage implications, of course, and then also impacts on the fetus or infant, which can be either immediate or long-term. So ultimately, what we have occurring is a lack of data, which often leads to either no treatment or treatment discontinuation. Within the COVID-19 example, that was actually a case where vaccines were still accessible to pregnant populations. But often cases, it actually means discontinuation or no treatment. And what that truly leads to is actually an increased risk of morbidity or mortality during pregnancy. So right now, what happens in terms of generating data for pregnant populations is that the initial drug labeling data come from non-clinical DART studies, so developmental and reproductive animal toxicity studies. And at the time of marketing authorization, there's often very little, if any, human data. Later on, we then get human data that follow through registry and real-world data that come post-authorization. This is kind of challenging. Of course, it's very time-delayed, but also the data that we get are really complex and hard to sort of tease out because they haven't come from that clinical trials setting where we've tried to minimize the bias. And so my soapbox today is that we should be empowering shared decision-making in pregnancy through earlier incorporation of clinical data and through supporting pregnant and lactating people to participate in clinical trials if they wish. So my real job today actually was to tell you about this concept paper that came out earlier this year. And so this is an ICH final concept paper that outlines the proposal of new guidelines for inclusion of and retention of pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials. Essentially, the concept paper has been released and the guideline will be coming in the coming years, and it will provide a harmonized look at how to define appropriate timing of inclusion of this population in clinical trials, the types of data that need to be collected from this population, planning for how to include the population, situations where inclusion is not recommended, and specific ethical considerations as well. So this is my last slide, just to show a bit of the timeline. These things, as you know, always take a long time. So the concept paper was endorsed earlier this year, and we anticipate the full guideline being completed by the end of 2025 or into 2026. So happy to talk in the panel later about all the considerations for this population. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Ms. Munaza Jamil has been engaged in the world of clinical research for almost 25 years. She currently leads the Quality Assurance Program at MICYRN. She sits on the Executive Board of ACRP Canada and chairs the N2 Clinical Trials Education and Awareness Committee. She also works with the Joint Task Force on Clinical Trials Competency out of Harvard, which has defined the core competency framework for clinical research professionals globally. She's on the faculty of McMaster University, where she teaches clinical trial courses in the Applied Clinical Trials Research Program. She'll be speaking on inclusion of new immigrants in clinical trials.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure. I've traveled all the way from Toronto last night, and it was a 5.5-hour flight with about 3-hour delay. So I've been up since 3 o'clock this morning, so I don't know how coherent my presentation will be, but well, I'll do my best. My topic is the immigrant community in terms of enhancing diversity in clinical trials. And I don't know how this goes. Okay, there we go. So we know, of course, that historically clinical trials have lacked in diverse representation in their study populations, and this is true of Canadian studies as well, where many studies disproportionately represent Caucasians, despite the diverse population of Canada. And diversity is, of course, it's imperative for assessment of population-specific risks and efficacy of interventions and generalization of the research. So the first step, education and awareness regarding clinical trials with immigrant populations, is an important step in this process. Why is this group important? So 2 things that I wanted to point out over here. During the 2021 census, 1 in 4 people were counted or had been self-identified as a landed immigrant or permanent resident in Canada, which is the highest proportion since Confederation and the largest proportion amongst all G7 countries. And according to Stats Canada, by 2041, 34% of the population of Canada would have been born outside of the country. So what are some barriers for newcomers in terms of participating in clinical trials? So the very first thing is understanding and trust of the research system. So first off, are they aware of the research that might be available to them? Are they properly educated about the safeguards that are in place to protect them? The research process barriers, so what is the language that is being used in clinical trials, and are they familiar with English or French? And the eligibility criteria as well. We have to think about whether it is truly accommodative and inclusionary. There's some personal influences, of course, that everybody brings to the table, cultural differences, religious practices, and then historical contexts as well. So has that particular community been historically mistreated by authority or healthcare? There's a level of mistrust with the healthcare system, negative experiences and such. So we know that the effect of immigration, whether it's voluntary or it's forced, does affect behavior and cause health problems. Immigrants who fear authority often avoid seeking medical help, which can delay preventative care and then also leads to worsening and more costly long-term illnesses. We know that refugees and asylum seekers face substantial risks of injury, abuse, torture, trauma, etc. And then we know that there's pre-migration trauma, post-migration stressors put these individuals at high risk for mental health concerns, others as well, which might benefit from special attention within the world of clinical trials. So what should we do? Building trust is really a key and very, very important step, some action steps that we can take. So we would ideally want to have a partnership between healthcare researchers, study teams, and community leaders. So a collaboration between healthcare providers and communities to help build that partnership and that trust. Oftentimes newcomers, new immigrants will access basic healthcare through family physicians. So seeking the endorsement of those individuals who are already embedded within the newcomer circle of care, and then using that to sort of, enter into that community, and also seeking endorsement from community leaders as well. The third piece is extremely, extremely important, and especially to me personally. We want to make sure that we are embedding family members and caregivers of these individuals into the research circle as well. A lot of immigrant communities have very tightly knit families, and they function as cohesive units when making decisions. And so to bring them on, to onboard them as assets and truly embed them from the very start into the research journey will actually help you it'll help make your project successful, and it'll also, I think, enhance the journey of the participant. And as a caregiver with lived experience to my mom, who was a research participant, and she was suffering from cancer, and she passed away actually 3 weeks ago exactly today. I can tell you that having individuals whose first language may not be English, who may not be very comfortable speaking English, to include trusted family members in that research clinical trials journey will truly benefit both parties. So I'll give you an example. I was with my mom once at a hospital in Toronto, and we were approached in the waiting room by a research nurse, and she sat down and she wanted to give us some information about a potential clinical trial that my mom could be a part of. And so we were really, really interested, and we sat down with her, and she started to ask some questions, and my mom was quite familiar with English, but not as fluent and not as able to, think quickly, and especially being ill and having chemotherapy, etc. So when she was asked a question, she looked at me, and I started to, answer for her, and the research nurse right away, she did this. She said, "Stop. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the participant. I want to hear from her." And right away I thought, well, first of all, you're not getting her enrolled today. She's not going to consent now, because you've just actually given her this, this signal that I'm not welcome, in her decision-making process, in her circle of care. So she's not going to be very happy to be participating alone. She actually can't. And so that's it. That's the end of the conversation. So if she had taken a different approach, we could have been very successfully consented that day, and we could have moved on into our journey. So this is extremely important. And then whatever results we have, whatever data we're able to collect, it's really important to bring it back to that community and to present back to them as well, to close that loop. What else can we do? We can diversify our clinical trials workforce. We can ensure that we have people on our study teams that are ethnicity matching, perhaps gender matching when approaching patients from diverse places. Train ourselves with cultural sensitivity and cultural competence, and really try to embed these inclusive behaviors, when trying to develop materials, for example, or using language and things like that. So to this end, I'm actually chairing one of the N2 committees, which is on clinical trials education and awareness. And part of that committee's work earlier this year, we took advantage of a CIHR grant where we wanted to apply for a Café Scientifique program. And for those of you who know what that is, it's just a workshop or an event that we would like to hold with new immigrants to Canada, defined by those who lived here less than 5 years in Toronto. So we were awarded this grant. in June, and we then proceeded to hold that public consultation with the immigrant community in Toronto in October. The objectives of our program, so we wanted to increase awareness and understanding of clinical trials within the new immigrant communities, have an increased understanding of the barriers that newcomers experience to participating in clinical trials, enabling the clinical trials community to develop effective materials to engage new immigrants, and to create a model for future workshops that would enable the clinical trial sector to host them within their own communities across Canada. A brief summary of our learning. So since it just took place about 5-6 weeks ago, we're still working on the data that we've gathered, but a summary slide I wanted to present here. Accessibility, so unsure of where to find reliable information. We had about, I think, 50 members of the public attend this consultation event, and the majority of them said, that they're just really not even sure. They don't trust websites. They would like to receive information in person from a trusted individual, or workshops like these where there's other members of the community there as well with them. Trust, so trust in healthcare providers, in the healthcare system, in the research system. Cultural values, so going back to the cultural competence and cultural sensitivity. Communication, so people wanted to have their family members involved in decisions, as I've mentioned before. Transparency, a lot of concern about receiving a placebo, about not receiving updates on their study condition, about healthcare providers being paid to conduct trials, and maybe not even being told about the risks properly. And then language accessibility as well. So new immigrants would, of course, benefit from clinical trials related materials that are translated into their languages to help them understand better. And one of the really good ideas that I actually received from a member of the audience that day was the presentation that we were delivering. They wanted to know if we could record it with subtitles, because a lot of people would be able to read English better than to hear and understand as we were speaking. So very important takeaway. Next steps. So education and awareness is needed, of course, about why inclusion of this underrepresented group is critical in enhancing diversity in clinical trials. Training in cultural competence is needed for our clinical trials community. And then I'd like to advocate for an infrastructure to be put in place so that there are meaningful partnerships that can be made between researchers and study teams and underserved communities. And that's it. Thank you.